We've all done it. Written a scene or a chapter, but when we read it back to ourselves, it sounds flat, boring, hollow, or trite. Or we've given a piece of writing to beta readers who report that it's missing something, not resonating with them, or the real kiss of death, it was okay. Why does this happen? Our stories are bright and vibrant in our minds, so why do they come out flat on the page? The truth is, the only way to hook your reader is through emotion. Not the emotions of the characters, but by evoking emotion in the reader, by giving them a truly emotional experience while reading your story. And how do we do that? Through the psychology of human change. Welcome to Six Figure Storyteller, the podcast where you'll get tips and tricks for understanding character psychology and using emotion to hook your reader on every single page. So grab your fuzzy slippers and your chocolate of choice, and let's dive in. Hey guys, welcome back to the Six Figure Storyteller podcast. It's been a while since I just did a podcast. I've been doing some YouTube videos and such, but I really want to get back to doing a weekly podcast because I like it and it's fun and I enjoy talking to you guys. So thanks for being here with me today. We are going to talk about how to fix a hollow or boring story. So there's a few things that might be indicators that your story is not really resonating very well, okay? So a few things. The number one is just that you get feedback that it isn't. Maybe you've given it to beta readers or someone else to read and they say things like, oh, I couldn't really get into it, or it lost me, or the dreaded, it was okay. It was good, but, right? All of those things are kind of the kiss of death for your story, because generally what they mean is that it's not landing emotionally with your reader, okay? Your story should be so compelling to your reader that they can't not finish reading it. And if it's like, yeah, it was okay, then clearly it's not very compelling to them. They're not having an emotional reaction to your story, or at least not a big enough one that it makes them want to keep reading, okay? And they're just being nice. They're not telling you, oh, this is boring, or oh, I didn't like this, the writing was terrible, because they're trying to spare your feelings, okay? And of course, just because it's not resonating doesn't mean any of that. It doesn't mean the writing is terrible, or that you aren't talented. It just means that you've got some things you need to fix, right? Another sign that it might be landing flatly is when you read it back to yourself and you feel like it's boring. I know this is hard for readers to hear, but however you feel about your story, your reader is going to feel the same way. So if you are reading it back to yourself and you feel like it's flat and boring, it just might be. And again, please don't let that discourage you, okay? It's fixable and it's fairly easy to fix it. You just need to know how. So if you're worried that it's boring, you're worried that it's not good enough, or you're even worried that you're going to do all of this work and then the book's going to flop because you don't think your reader will like it, those are all signs that you're probably missing some emotion, okay? So here's the thing. Marketing is, of course, important. You need to get your book in front of the right readers, but all the marketing in the world will not truly help you if your book is hollow, boring, or does not resonate with readers. Good marketing can get you a slew of sales up front, but once readers start to actually read your book and discover that it is not giving them an emotional experience, they're going to drop it real fast. Your sales are going to fall right off a cliff. And of course, you don't want that because, obviously you don't want it for the most obvious reasons. But the bigger problem is that those readers are never going to come back to you because they will remember that your book was boring and they didn't like it and it didn't do much for them, okay? Our job as the author, of course, it is to tell a great story, but it is specifically to give our readers an emotional experience of our story. And what emotion that is going to depend on the genre of story that we're telling and, the part of the story we're in. Obviously, there's going to be different emotions in the first part of the story versus the last part of the story, all of that. But no matter what the emotion is, whatever is appropriate to your story and your tropes and your genre, we need to give the reader a highly, highly emotional experience. And you have to understand that the number one way to hook a reader, in fact, I would say the only way to hook a reader is through emotion. So here's a problem, guys, that most of us don't really think about, okay? I've even talked about a lot on this podcast how readers cannot usually articulate what is wrong with the story. They will say, things I've already said, like, oh, it was boring, or it lost me, or I didn't like the ending, or I couldn't understand why the character was doing that, things like that. But they cannot articulate, oh, she's missing part of the third act, in the 4-act structure. I mean, they're just not going to talk about it that way. They're going to talk about their emotional experience with it. And that's because when we read books, when we absorb any kind of story, we are using our emotions to absorb them. We are having an emotional experience. You can think about this with books, with songs, with plays, with films, anything. If we're bored, it's because we're not feeling anything during that part of the story. And if we are feeling something, the bigger something we're feeling, the bigger the emotional reaction we're having, the more we're going to be riveted to that story, okay? And the disconnect really comes because when readers are trying to leave a review and trying to analyze the reasons that they didn't like the story, they're using their logical, conscious mind to do that, okay? So they're going to say things like, oh, I didn't understand this, or oh, the end was boring, but they can't articulate things in terms of emotion, right? But the one and only way to hook a reader is through emotion. We have to give them an emotional experience. And that doesn't necessarily mean character emotion, okay? So when I tell you to write an emotional story, I'm not saying that the characters need to laugh more or cry more or punch each other in the face more. No, I mean, if that's appropriate to your scene, that's fine. But what we're really talking about here is writing your story in a way that creates an emotional experience for the reader. And that's a whole different thing, okay? That's where transformational human psychology comes in. That's where, the 10 plot points and the inner arc and all kinds of things come in. There really is a step-by-step formula for turning your unique story into something that is absolutely unputdownable and creates emotion for your reader. It's not as hard as it may sound. We always think that this sort of thing is really hard because when we're doing it on our own, we've just never been taught how to craft our story based on that emotion. And so we are banging our head against the desk trying to figure out why our story is reading so flat and why it doesn't sound like all of our favorite authors, right? So now that you know that the number one way and really only way to hook readers is through emotion, the next question is, how do we get that emotion into our stories? Well, this is what I call transformational human psychology, but if you don't want me to use such big words, because I know they're a mouthful, it really has to do with the inner arc. So you have really two parts to your story, right? We have the outer arc, external arc, also known as the plot. That is what is actually happening in the events of the story. Then there's the inner arc. That's what's happening inside your protagonist or inside any given character. It is what they are going through emotionally. It is the change they're going to go through emotionally. Now, there are some stories that have what we call flat arcs. And what that means is that there isn't a change the character goes through. And that is a thing in writing. It is not my favorite thing. I do not write flat arc stories because I feel like we should always be giving ourselves the best chance to succeed. And by that, I mean, give yourself every possible chance to get emotion into your story and create that emotional experience for your reader. And if you're writing a flat arc, you've just cut out about half of that chance. So a flat arc just means that the character does not change, is not dynamic by the end of the story. They still go through an arc of sorts. And usually what it means is that they have to learn something or be resourceful in order to beat the villain. But they don't go through any sort of deep emotional or spiritual change. Now, those kind of stories aren't bad, the flat arc ones. In fact, there are a lot of really famous stories that have flat arcs. So I'm not going to tell you that you shouldn't write those. It's just going to be based on your personal taste. And it's very subjective, right? But again, if you want to write an emotional story, if you want to write the kind of story that creates mega fans and that readers cling on to and talk about long after they've read the last page, you really need to have the dynamic arc. The transformation of the character, seeing them change in their internal arc, is going to be the thing that creates the most emotion in your story. It's what creates the catharsis that we're hoping our readers will go through. And we do that specifically by having a character transformation. And this is an inward transformation, right? So if your story or your chapter, if we're talking about a scene or a chapter, is reading as hollow or boring, then I'm here to tell you that one of two things is going on. It could be a problem at the story level, and that means that there's not enough emotion in the larger beats of the story, and that can be the internal arc or it can be the plot. So in terms of the internal arc, it just means that you do not have a fully fleshed out and intentional internal arc. Now, I keep saying intentional, and the reason for that is that so often authors, they might have a change, they might create a dynamic character, but it's very much an afterthought or something that they just kind of throw together really quickly. Like, oh, they feel this way at the beginning and then they'll feel differently at the end. Okay, that's the change. And you guys, I'm telling you, that is not nearly enough to keep your reader riveted and to give them the emotional experience, okay? You need to be intentionally and very detailedly creating the transformation for the character, and you do that via the inner arc, okay? So that could be the problem. Or it really could be the plot as well. This transformational human psychology, there is a way to apply it to the plot, which, you know, is again, just the most logical thing. We're going to have the internal arc, which creates the most emotion, but why not craft your plot to also create emotion for the reader? We're going to do it on every level so that we have every chance to hook our reader on every single page in every single scene and keep them turning pages to the very, very end. So those are the two things that could be the story level problems. If your story is reading as hollow or boring, you just need the psychology. You need to flesh out your internal and external arcs, and you need to match them to that human transformational process that readers will automatically identify with, right? The other thing that could be going on if your story is reading as hollow or boring could be more of on a scene level. The actual words and phrases that you're putting on the page are not evoking enough emotion. And there's a few reasons that this happens. First of all, you need to know your characters very deeply. You need to know their fears, their insecurities, their personalities, how they react to certain things. People, very often I get authors saying, okay, well, I planned all of that, but how do I get it on the page? And very often they have not planned it in great detail. They've just thought about it. And so they think they've planned it. But here's the thing. When something is knocking around in your head, in your imagination, it tends to be very nebulous, which means we have a hard time grasping it. And then we're going to have a really hard time translating it onto the page. Okay. Once we actually bring it forward into our conscious mind and write it down, then it solidifies. And then once we have that written down so where we can look at it and know that that is what we're going to be doing with our character or with our story, it is much, much easier at that point to get it onto the page. Okay, so we need to plan these things. Even though, you know, the first things I talked about was the story level stuff and more like planning the internal and external arc. Doing that actually will help you get it onto the page even better, get the emotion onto the page, just because you've planned that really well and in great detail. But beyond that, it's also a matter of making sure that you're getting the characters' thoughts, feelings, and body language onto the page. That may seem obvious, but I'm telling you, most of the scenes I read in which it feels like there's not enough emotion and their reading is flat, doesn't have these things. There's a description of the setting and there's a lot of dialogue and, you know, maybe there's plenty of dialogue tags and some body language and some narrative here and there. But the biggest thing people don't think about is getting the characters' reactions to what is going on. And that is going to come in the form of either verbal dialogue, thoughts, which are internal dialogue, feelings, you know, what they're feeling emotionally or in their bodies, and then body language, like physical reactions to things. And that is what actually helps the reader drop into the story and really experience it vicariously through the characters. If we're just doing dialogue of, you know, what they're saying with nothing else, I mean, that's not how we live our lives, right? We have bodies with physical sensations. We have thoughts and feelings about everything that goes on around us, what people say, what's going on, where we are, what we're doing. And so you've got to make sure and get those onto the page, because not only will they make for a more smoothly read scene, but they actually create emotion for the reader because it's an experience, right? They're using their five senses to experience this, not just one or two. So to sum up here, if your story feels hollow or boring, you need to make sure that you are dialing in the psychology of your internal arc and of your plot. And then you need to make sure that you are documenting in the scene the characters' reactions, which are thoughts, feelings, dialogue, and physical sensations to what's going on around them. So if you're stuck, ask yourself, how is my character reacting to this? What do they think? What do they feel? Where are they feeling it? And this is things like a feeling in the pit of your stomach, right? Or fear rolling down your spine. I mean, these are things that we're all familiar with, but sometimes we forget to put them into our own writing. So bottom line, People in our industry like to say that there's no one way to do writing, and that is true, especially when it comes to the writing process. But unfortunately, it also gives us this impression that there's no way to know for sure if our stories will land with the reader. And that is actually untrue. I've literally heard people who are teaching writing say that. Well, you're not going to really know how good your story is until you give it to your reader. And you guys, I'm here to call BS on that, okay? If you understand human psychology, how to get the emotion onto the page, and I know psychology is a big word. It can be a little bit daunting, but I'm not talking about reading a psychology textbook here, okay? That is very specifically not going to help you. I'm talking about the basics of psychology. If you can understand an episode of Criminal Minds or understand the psychology in the relationships of Grey's Anatomy, then that is the kind of psychology that I'm talking about. Understanding that someone who has undergone abuse in the past acts this way because of that abuse, or somebody who has daddy issues or mommy issues. That's the kind of psychology I'm talking about. And I know all of you can understand that. You wouldn't be writers otherwise, okay? But if you can understand how to get that kind of thing into your story, you can absolutely know whether it's going to resonate with readers or not. And there are ways to know whether the writing of it, the actual words and phrases that you use, are going to evoke emotion as well. Okay, so knowledge of how to do this is what I call the unputdownable fiction code, okay? It is a secret, very little known code for how to make your unique genius story unputdownable to readers. And of course, the reason it's unputdownable is because they are having a deeply emotional experience. Doesn't matter what genre, doesn't matter what characters, doesn't matter what tropes you're using. You can do this with any story, any characters, and it's not about what you write in your story. This definitely does help you fill out your story if you don't have everything in the muddy middle or you're not sure what the ending is. I mean, this definitely helps with that. But whatever your unique genius premise is, you can do this with it. It's not about changing what you've already come up with for your story. It's about taking your story and making it the most emotional and unputdownable version of itself, okay? So the unputdownable fiction code is based in psychology and emotion. And when I teach it to my students who are all aspiring authors, the number one reaction I get is that they are just mind blown by it. They say they can't believe how helpful it is. They can't believe how much more detail they had on their story or their characters that they never realized before. Things they'd never thought of before. And understand, this isn't about talent and it's not about creativity. It's just that they'd never been taught how to do this before. We don't teach this well in our space. We don't teach the psychology of story. We don't teach how to get emotion onto the page. We don't even teach that it's emotion that hooks readers, or at least not very well. We're getting to the point where this is becoming more mainstream now, but it's still not very well taught, okay? So this is what I teach, and if you want to learn it, then click the link that I'm going to put in the show notes to check out the Unputdownable Fiction Code course, and it will help you turn your genius story into an unputdownable novel, all right? So I hope that was helpful to you if you are having trouble with your story reading as flat or hollow. Thanks so much for listening today, and I will be back with more unputdownable fiction tips very soon. Bye. Hey there, aspiring author. Thanks for listening today. If you enjoyed today's episode, could you do me a solid and share it with another author? We should be getting as many emotional stories as possible into the world so that all readers and authors are uplifted. Spreading the word serves other authors and helps the podcast grow. And if you're ready to transform your genius story into the most unputdownable version of itself, come join us inside the Unputdownable Code. Check the show notes for where, and I'll see you inside. Remember, you have a story inside you that only you can tell, and your perfect readers are waiting for it with bated breath.